bringing to life the souls of the past that until now have been lost to history. Talking Hart Island is a half-hour weekly podcast that explores the history of Hart Island, America's largest mass graveyard. Hart Island has been used as New York City's Potter's Field since 1869. It is estimated there are over 1 million people buried there. Because of recent advances in DNA and fingerprint technology, the identities of some of these previously forgotten and anonymous people have been revealed. The results are truly shocking. Talking Hart Island will interview a special guest each week, selected from an extraordinary assembly of scholars, authors, and scientists in the fields of history, law, medicine, and the arts, as we unravel a secret kept hidden for 150 years. So welcome to Talking Hart Island. And now, here's our host, investigative history writer Michael T. Keene.
Thank you very much, Norma Jean. And this is Michael Keene, and we are Talking Hart Island. One quick thing before we begin. We've been asked how you can pick up a copy of our book, New York City's Hart Island, A Cemetery of Strangers, or our audio book, which is narrated by Norma Jean Gratzky. And you may do so by simply logging on to our website, michaeltkeene.com. In George Appo's world, child pickpockets swarmed the crowded streets, addicts drifted in furtive opium dens, and expert swindlers worked the lucrative green goods game. On a good night, Appo made as much as a skilled laborer made in a year. Bad nights left him with more than a dozen scars and over a decade in prison. The child of Irish and Chinese immigrants, Appo grew up in the notorious Five Points and Chinatown neighborhoods. Here is the underworld of the New York that gave us Edith Wharton, Boss Tweed, Central Park, the Brooklyn Bridge, and ultimately Hart Island. Timothy Gilfoyle is an American historian from New York who is a professor of history at Loyola University, Chicago, where he teaches American urban and social history. He earned his Ph.D. in history at Columbia University. He's the former president of the Urban History Association. His academic research is mainly concerned with the evolution of 19th century underworld, subcultures, and informal economies. And he's here today to primarily talk about his book, A Pickpockets Tale. And Professor Gilfoyle, welcome to Talking Hart Island. How are you?
Very good, and thank you for having me on your show, Mike.
Oh, it's our pleasure. I just want to kind of state from the outset that we're working under a little duress. Literally, as we speak, the Blue Angels are flying over Professor Gilfoyle's house. So if you happen to hear a sonic boom, it's not the police trying to break in. Although from your work, Professor Gilfoyle, I would say we can't necessarily rule that out. Tell me, what led you to kind of concentrate your research efforts on what I would call the underbelly of 19th century New York history?
Well, Mike, I think that in any society, the treatment of crime and criminal individuals raises fundamental questions about that society. And that's what originally provoked my interest in 19th century New York and in its 19th century criminal underworld. Questions about what is good, what is evil, how do you define crime, what is justice or injustice, how do you create a good society, how is this done in the past? These are all fundamental questions that really any historian has to ask, and particularly in regards to crime or illicit, illegal, illegitimate activity, however you want to, whatever label you want to use, it raises fundamental questions about that society and its history. And ultimately, those questions can become very political, very personal. How do we fit into that history? Am I a good person, a bad person? Ultimately, who am I? And so I think that broad explanation points to why I was interested in exploring the 19th century underworld in New York.
And the story of George Appo, of course, is the centerpiece of A Pickpocket's Tale. Can you tell us who he was?
Sure. Well, my interest in Appo was generated by a single document. He, near the end of his life, wrote a crude autobiography, which is sitting in an archive in New York, specifically at Columbia University. It's a 99-page typewritten stream of consciousness document. There's only 6 paragraph breaks in the entire 99 pages. It's typewritten, but it gives a very vivid account, a first-person account of what it was like to live in the 19th century criminal universes of New York. In a sense, it's a bit like a 19th century version of Nicholas Pileggi's Wise Guy that became the basis for the movie Goodfellas. And Appo, although he's been largely forgotten today, was one of the earliest, what we might call today, professional criminals. His life is really an exemplary life of what it was like to live in the 19th century underworld. And as you mentioned, he came from a racially mixed background. His mom was an Irish immigrant. His father was a Chinese immigrant. Both of them had somewhat interesting lives themselves. But he was generally abandoned by them through various circumstances he couldn't control as a child, and then grew up literally on the streets in Five Points, which was the most infamous 19th century ghetto, if you want to use that word, in the United States. Never went to school a day in his life. Eventually became a newsboy before the age of 10. And as working as a newsboy, his fellow compatriots taught him how to pickpocket. And that began his nearly 3-decade life as a pickpocket. So he didn't have any of the traditional institutions that we associate with 19th century American life, and especially American mobility. There's no family for him. There's no economic or employment opportunities. The church is non-existent in his life, and he has no educational opportunities. So his life in many ways reflects some of the same kinds of structural problems that exist in criminal underworlds today, or at least in criminal subcultures, what we would call criminal subcultures: the lack of family structures and employment opportunities and educational institutions. And as he grew into adulthood, he went into other kinds, what were called sure thing grafts, more lucrative criminal activities that were less risky than picking pockets. That led to his involvement in the green goods game, which we can talk about a little bit later. And eventually he even became an opium addict. So his life is, in many ways, it's the first involvement with a kind of underground drug subculture, which becomes very prevalent in the 20th century. And so he's going to opium dens as a young man. He's participating even in medical research on opium smoking, some of the first medical work that's done on opium smoking. He's one of the subjects. He eventually gets involved with some off-Broadway plays on vaudeville, where he's asked to play himself on stage during the 1890s. And he gets, as you mentioned, he's arrested numerous times, more than a dozen times. He ends up in 8 different kinds of prisons, spends roughly a total of a decade in prison, experiences many kinds of incarceral experiences where he's in the harsh penitentiaries of places like Sing Sing in New York and Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, and then in much lax institutions such as Blackwell's Island in New York. So in many ways, his life speaks to the variety of incarceration experiences, the rise of that carceral society that we often talk a lot about today. And so his life serves as a kind of prism, a window, a vantage point into the 19th century criminal subcultures.
You mentioned that his parents had an interesting background. How so?
Well, it's a little unclear as to where his mom and dad met, but his father, Chang Quimbo Appo, came to the United States in the late 1840s. It might be not inaccurate to refer to him as a 49er. He works briefly as a tea merchant in San Francisco at a time when there's very, very few Chinese immigrants in San Francisco in 47, 48. And then in 49, he moves into the gold fields. He has a near-death experience where a group of men attack him and his friend. They kill his friend. He allegedly killed somebody, one of his taggers, in self-defense. And somehow he ends up fleeing the gold fields, ends up in New Haven, Connecticut, of all places. There he probably met Catherine Fitzpatrick. He ran a tea store in New Haven. Actually appears, an advertisement for his tea store appears in the New Haven City Directory in the mid-1850s. So he had to be somewhat of a prosperous merchant. And his son, George Washington Appo, named after the first president, in ways a reflection that Quimbo Appo was very interested in assimilating and becoming an American citizen. He's born on the 4th of July, 1856, and shortly thereafter they moved to New York. And his wife allegedly was suffering from alcoholism. He came home one day from work. She was intoxicated. He got into a fight with the landlady. And in the course of their confrontation, the lady either fell over or was hit by Quimbo Appo and died. And that led to a trial, and he became the first, a murder trial, and he became the first Chinese immigrant or Chinese American or individual of Asian descent to ever be convicted of a capital crime on the East Coast in the United States. And eventually that sentence was commuted to 10 years. And I spend time on this only because when George Appo first went to Sing Sing for his second pickpocket conviction in the mid 1870s, he ran into his father in Sing Sing. So in some ways, real life can be stranger and more unbelievable than fiction, and George Appo's life reflects that. His mother, after that, vanishes. He was led to believe that she died in an accident at sea, but I have some questions that ever really happened. So, and Quimbo Appo then is in and out of prison the rest of his life. Eventually, ends up, to make a very long story short, in the state asylum for the criminally insane. Gets eventually transferred to a new facility in the 1890s called the Matteawan State Hospital for the criminally insane, which is located up in Beacon, New York, up the Hudson River. And ironically, again, he runs into George Appo at that institution near the end of his life. And he eventually dies there, and he's buried in an unmarked grave today outside of the what was then the prison facilities.
Speaking of unmarked graves, I believe there's a reference to Hart Island in your book.
There is, yes.
What is that?
So that gets to the questions about George Appo's the different kinds of incarceration experiences he endured. So when George Appo was about 15, there's always a little bit of confusion in his autobiography about his precise age, because he thought he was born in 1858, but in fact, I found his birth certificate and his birth registrar and his baptismal certificate, and he is baptized in a Roman Catholic church. And he was born in 1856, and so he's always 2 years older than he thinks. So in 1871, when he's about 15 years old, he's arrested for pickpocketing. This is the first time that he's arrested for pickpocketing, and he's sentenced to the school ship Mercury, which was a reform experiment, very much ahead of its time, almost a kind of progressive era reform institution that functioned in New York between 1869 and 1875. And young boys, and they were only boys, usually between under the age of 16, who were usually sentenced to prison or to the penitentiary on Blackwell's Island, were sentenced to the school ship Mercury, where they would be trained in seamanship and eventually go on a trip across the Atlantic to the Canary Islands and the Madeira Islands, down to Brazil, and then up to the Caribbean, and then back up to New York, where they would learn the different techniques related to seamanship, and then hopefully be trained to go into the merchant marine. Well, when they were waiting for the ship to dock, to come back, or for enough young boys to be able to be put on the ship, they were employed as grave diggers over on Hart Island, which shortly after it was purchased by the city of New York in the late 1860s, became the massive Potter's Field, where New York buried the city's deceased, homeless, unknown, or unwanted citizens. And so that was George Appo's connection with Hart Island.
That's unbelievable. It really is. You prefaced your remarks by describing this 99-page document that was written by George Appo, and both you and I, offline, so to speak, pondered as to why he might have written that. Any further thoughts on what was his intention, his motivation to write this document?
Sure. Well, we can only speculate, because he never expressly explains the origins of the document, and the manuscript, the 99-page typewritten document, is just sitting in a folder in the Society for the Prevention of Crime Papers, which is a private reform-based organization founded in the originally in the 1870s, but by the 1890s it had become a more active force associated with the Reverend Charles Parkhurst, the anti-tammany reformer, and was involved in various kinds of anti-gambling, anti-opium programs during the 1890s and early 20th century. And when Appo eventually was released from the Matteawan State Hospital for the criminally insane, he decided, in his own words, to turn a new leaf and wanted to avoid engaging in any more underworld or criminal activities, and began cooperating with the SPC. And so I think we can assume that at some point in the 19-teens, 1913, 1914, 1915, that someone approached Appo and asked him, or encouraged him, to write about his life story, that he had this interesting tale to tell, and that he should do so, and which is what he did. And it is a very crude document, as I mentioned, 99 pages, only 6 paragraph breaks. It's written in a stream of consciousness format. Many of the details are out of chronological order, so it's at first difficult to figure out when certain events are happening. But I was able to corroborate most of the events that he describes. He may be off by a year or two, or he may be off by a few blocks if he gives an address, or certain events are not, as I said, in the right chronological order. But many of the people he describes and many of the events he narrates are all verifiable in other criminal records or even newspaper accounts. So again, this provides a unique first-person account of a historical life, a historical experience that really doesn't get told very much, especially in the 19th century.
Did he write at all about how not to get your pockets picked, or to become a victim of any of the criminal activities that he was involved in?
Not so much. No, he never gave those kinds of expressed warnings. It was more. It was pretty much a straight narrative about his individual experiences, and near the end of the document, he starts to reminisce a little bit about his philosophy in life and how he functioned within the particular criminal subcultures that he lived and operated. And he takes great pride in calling himself a good fella. And this is one of the earliest references to that term that became much more famous in the 20th century, especially with the movie Goodfellas, where he describes himself as someone who has a certain sense of loyalty to his fellow pickpockets, his fellow operatives in the green goods game, just those working in his underworld universe, that they had their own special language or argot, they had their own special value system, they didn't cooperate with the police, they didn't rat on one another, sort of many of the same kinds of informal structures that we associate with so-called organized crime in the 20th century. So again, we see some of the origins of certain kinds of 20th and 21st century behaviors originating here in 19th century New York.
What was the green goods game?
The green goods game. What Alan Pinkerton, probably America's most famous 19th century detective, called the most remunerative of all swindles. This was a very elaborate confidence game, and it works something like this. Operators who were largely located in New York or the New York metropolitan area would send out letters, what they called circulars, throughout the United States to individuals that they thought would be susceptible to this scheme. Oftentimes people who had gone bankrupt or who had mortgage problems. And they claimed in these circulars that they had possessed or stolen or gained control of discarded currency engraving plates, and that they could manufacture counterfeit money that looked just like the real greenbacks or green goods, hence the name. And they would offer this counterfeit money at cut rate prices. So for $100, you could get $600 to $1,000 worth of counterfeit notes. And if you purchased the maximum, which would have been, give or take, about well over $1,000, you would have what they called states' rights in the area. So they wouldn't sell it to anybody in your immediate area. And so if you were interested in this, and all kinds of people would be interested in this, if you're down on your luck or gone bankrupt or you're a businessman looking for a quick infusion of cash. Appo even described the African-American minister from the South who was one of their victims coming up because he wanted to build a church for his congregation. So the interested parties, or the guy, or the come on, as they were called, were instructed to travel to New York. They would meet them at a hotel in the New York metropolitan area. They would be met by a bunco steerer, and that was what George Appo was, who would then steer them to a turning joint, as they called it, another hotel usually, where they would meet the old gentleman who would describe and arrange the transaction. They would display the goods on a table. In fact, it was real legal tender that they were displaying, so of course it looked real. Usually then they agreed to make the purchase. And in the process, in the transaction as it unfolded, when the victim would turn their back on the goods, somebody would, there would be a moving panel behind the wall. They would switch the bag or the satchel and replace the satchel with another bag. If they got suspicious, then they were told not to open the goods because the cops were looking out for this. If they got suspicious, they oftentimes had a tailor, as they called them, someone who was following them, who would then, sometimes dressed as a cop, who would tell them to get out of town. And in most cases, they just did what they were told, didn't open the bag, got home to open the bag, and there it would be filled with blank paper, a brick, and sometimes sawdust. And in fact, in the early days, it was called the sawdust game. And so here they were, humiliated, empty-handed, and not able to protest because they had, in fact, been guilty of attempting to defraud the federal government. So it was an extremely complicated game. And the most successful operations required a considerable amount of finance. You usually had to display at least $1,000, sometimes as much as $10,000 worth of legal tender. So you needed to have access to a great deal of cash. And it required a great deal of organization. We don't have precise records about the amount of money that was made, but according to the most successful operators, they claim that they had fortunes in excess of $100,000, which would be well over $2 million in contemporary money. And even someone like a low-level operator, a steerer like George Appo, would earn as much as $30 to $100 in a day, which was much more safe and lucrative than picking people's pockets. And in many ways, the green goods game reflected how criminal activities were changing in the second half of the 19th century, especially after the Civil War, because the whole con was facilitated by such new institutions as the Transcontinental Railroad that allowed people to move quickly all across the country, new mass communication systems facilitated by the telegraph and the Continental Postal Service. With the Civil War, for the first time, you have a unified national currency, the Greenback Act that was passed during the Civil War. So now you have an actual national currency. And then the changing patterns of urban leisure with the rise of dives, as they were called, and opium dens. And all of this facilitated a kind of new national underground or informal economy that emerges in the 1870s, 1880s, well into the 1890s.
In the few seconds that we have left, how could one of our listeners pick up a copy of the Pickpockets tale? Hopefully they'll do that legally. Do you have a website or?
Well, I think the quickest place is to go to W.W. Norton. That's my publisher. And you can get it right there on their website.
Well, this has been fascinating, and the fact that it has a connection to Hart Island is incredible. And I want to thank you very much for being a guest on Talking Hart Island. Thank you very much, Professor Gilfoyle.
And thank you very much for having me and for your interest in George Appo.
Hi, this is Norma Jean. I wanted to take a moment to remind you, in order to receive updates or news about upcoming episodes of Talking Hart Island, simply go to the subscribe page on our website located at www.michaeltkeen.com and enter your email address. If you have any questions about the podcast itself or simply wish to contact any team members for book inquiries, voiceovers, website or graphics design, use our contact page, also found at www.michaeltkeen.com. And if you're enjoying the show and would like to give us a review, please do so at iTunes. We would greatly appreciate it. So until next week, this is Norma Jean, and we're Talking Hart Island.